Christmas is coming, and they're coming too, bringing some gifts and some baggage for you. 1 day, 2 day, 3 days or more. How do we survive those we adore? Your boss, whose idea of a holiday gift is making you work a long double shift. Your date for mom's dinner who still lives at home and is not well acquainted with hard work or a comb. Perhaps it's your spouse who's on your last nerve and you'd like to give them just what they deserve. Re-gifting that sweater which you know is too small, or coal in the stocking, or maybe nothing at all. Whomever the problem, whatever the reason, we all want to care for others this season. Yet friends and family, much loved though they be, can create much drama and much misery. What's to be done with all the confusion? Might we suggest an unsettling solution?
Hey, good news. I'm not singing, all right? I know some of you were like, don't quit your day job, dude. I get it. I'm going to leave that to my wife. She'll continue to sing. But hey, like Chanel said, we are just so delighted that you chose to be a part of North Tarrant this morning. My name is Scott Johnson. I'm the lead pastor here. And I get the chance from time to time to just to be able to share what God has challenged us with and what us as a church really looks like. And so for the last several weeks, we've been looking at this idea of the unsettling solution for just about everything. And we found that the answer to that is grace. Now, before we dance in, I wanted to throw some descriptive words at you that I think describe people pretty well. And as I do this, what I'm probably tempted to think is maybe I left something out. And if I did, feel free at the end just to kind of shout it out. Hey, Scott, you forgot me, and this is it. I mean, feel free to engage if you feel so compelled. But I want to ask you this. What do you call a group of people who are lying, cheating, greedy, covetous, lustful, porn-watching, tax-dodging, racist, jealous, judgmental, lonely, angry people who eat too much? Sorry, that kind of hit a little too close to home. Who spend too much, who drink too much, who medicate too much, who worry too much, who smoke too much, but who gather together because they believe Jesus is the light of the world and they need more light. Hope I didn't miss anybody. Now's not the time to be like, you missed me. It might cause awkward conversations this afternoon. In fact, if you came in here today and you're like, well, what is this? You know what you call this group of people? You call them the church. That's the best picture of the church I can imagine. Now, if you're a first-time guest here and you came and you're trying to figure out, wait a second, I thought the church was full of holy people. I might have just burst your bubble. I hate to break it to you, but the beautiful thing about the church is yeah, this might be descriptive of us, but there is a beautiful thing about being together that we can look beyond our vices and see something even greater. And it's odd for me from time to time when I hear people leverage this word, the church. They leverage it in such a way that it's this idea that it's an institution. It's something that people should it's an organization that should do things. Right? It's an institution as opposed to being people. And I hear it from time to time, and this is something that it's kind of fascinating. People will come to me as the person who wears the microphone on Sunday morning, and they'll make a declaration because of something they think or something they've seen or maybe something that they're curious about, and they make this statement. They say this: the church should take a stand. And it's a valuable statement, right? But in the back of my mind, I'm always tempted to think, well, what stand should we take? Should we take your stand or should we take somebody else's stand? Well, which stance should we take? And more often than not, if I were to pose that question, the response would be, well, if you're not going to take my stance, I don't want you to take any stance at all. Because let's be honest, I would just, there's this idea, this reality. We think that the church is an institution, that it's an organization that we should be making a stand. And what I've found to be true is this. And the beautiful thing is there's what we've seen as we've navigated Jesus is Jesus was full of grace and he was full of truth. He was full of grace and he was full of truth. And what I've seen as I've studied and I've looked at and tried to evaluate the life of Jesus is I've found that when it comes to the church, when it comes to us and we're not an institution, we are a group of people that really we're a group of messed up people. But the church ultimately is something that I don't think necessarily the church is something that everybody agrees on everything. It's not this idea that we've got to agree on everything. But the beautiful thing about the church is a group of imperfect people who have diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds who ultimately agree on two things. They agree on the idea, the fact, the truth that Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth on Christmas morning and lived a perfect life so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made right, so that we could live in harmony with a God who sent his Son, so that we could have a right relationship with God, who sent his Son on our behalf so that we won't fall short. But also agree that it is our priority to extend the grace that God first gave us to other people. We're a group of people who believe two ultimate things. That God sent his Son on our behalf to make a way for us to get to him, and that grace should compel us to offer grace to those around us. Now, I'll never forget, and you've probably heard me share this from time to time, but possibly one of my favorite Sundays as the pastor of North Tarrant Church just so happened to be the Sunday after the 2016 election. Regardless of where you stand. I had people that texted me and said, "Oh my goodness, what is happening in the world?" And I had people text me and said, "Oh my goodness, what is happening in the world?" And the beautiful thing is that those individuals that were distraught by and were excited over were collectively coming together because they agreed on two things: that Jesus truly does make our life better and he makes us better at life. So let's offer grace even in the differences. See, grace for our purposes today, grace is a lot like the oil in a machine. When you think about grace is a lot like the oil that runs in a machine. This past week, I actually got to see Brent Hamilton. We went to get our oil changed in our van, and one thing led to another. But the beautiful thing is I know that oil is a valuable thing in a car. I don't know exactly how to change it. I don't know exactly where you put it. I know where you put the gasoline. They made it really clear on the car. But here's what I do know is that the engine block, and you're probably going to see me in the gallery after this and be like, "Actually, Scott, you made that oversimplistic. It's not that simple." But here's what I know is the engine block and the pistons and everything inside the engine, they are so closely connected that if you don't have a lubricant, if you don't have oil that's working into the engine block, what you're going to do is you're going to cause so much friction that the engine is going to explode. I haven't figured that out yet by experience. I've heard that. I've seen YouTube videos. It's incredible. Go YouTube it and change your oil, all right? But grace is the oil in a machine. Grace is the oil in a relationship. It's what allows individuals who have differing political views to come together and to be able to be friends and be civil. Grace is the oil in a relationship that allows you to invite everybody over for Christmas. And all of your family and all of your nephews and everybody under one roof, and you're just praying, "Don't bring up that topic." Grace is the oil in the machine that allows the relationship to work properly. Without grace, you're going to find tension, and with the tension, you're going to find explosions. You see, ultimately, and the beautiful thing is this, is not only is it the oil in the relationship, but grace is the thing that Jesus brought to us. "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" is a popular song. And in the midst of that song, listen to what this lyric says. Grace is this idea that God and sinner reconciled. You see, what I found about grace is grace requires a relationship. Reconciliation requires a relationship. There's a difference between being right and being reconciled. You see, Jesus could have very easily come to be right. He could have very easily come to wave his finger and tell you, this is how you need to behave. But Jesus didn't come to be right. Jesus came to make things right with us. Reconciliation involves a relationship. And without grace, there is no reconciliation possible. Many of you hear that, and maybe it's not God and sinner reconciled, but there's someone in you that you would love to find reconciliation with. And the hurdle is that one or the other, or maybe both at this point, it's hard to really leverage grace. It's hard to really leverage that grace. But what we found is that God leveraged that grace on our behalf. And what I've come to find is this is what is true about grace, is grace becomes amazing when it's extended to others. I mean, we can hold on to reconciliation and we can hold a grudge, but ultimately it's not grace until it's extended. It's not grace until it's shared. It's not grace until you look at that relationship and you begin to lean into that relationship. And that's what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to share grace, to share grace with all of us, knowing, and we talked about our vices at the very beginning, we can all probably pick at least one. We're going to assume we're just almost, right? There's just one on there. Maybe we all spend too much. It's Christmas, right? We're going to leave the rest for everybody else, right? Let's be honest. We all fall prey to those. And yet Jesus looks at that and he says, you know what? I love you anyway. Grace becomes amazing when it is extended to others. And ultimately, God's amazing grace to you, it is an invitation for you to be amazing. God's amazing grace to you is an invitation for you to showcase that grace to other people. It's an opportunity for you to leverage, for you to share, for you to encourage, for you to be amazing. But isn't it true that it's hard to grant grace to other people? Isn't it true that when it comes to grace, sometimes it's hard for us to really lean in and offer grace and fight for reconciliation? But what I've found is this, is grace is our greatest opportunity. Grace is our greatest opportunity, yet extending grace can be very, very difficult for some of us. And I don't know your story. I don't know what the holidays bring, because oftentimes when it comes to grace, we have a little bit of a difficult time extending grace because we see that individual. We see how they've hurt us. We see how they've wronged us. We see how they've undermined us. When it comes to grace, maybe that person is not in our life, but the person has a group of people, if you will, that when you see them, when you see that job, when you see that employee, when you see that group of individuals, when you see that age range, when you see that school, when you see whatever it might be, it just floods the emotions and you begin to think, there's no way that I can share grace with them. And the truth is, this Christmas season, grace is an invitation for you and I to be amazing. And Jesus offered a question for all of us to evaluate when it comes to this idea of grace. Jesus offered us a question that could be a little bit challenging. He offered us a question that could be a little bit of a struggle when you really begin to read in and answer the question. It can challenge us. In fact, if I'm going to be honest, the question Jesus is about to levy is a question that if you're not a follower of Jesus, this might be enough for you to say, never. But if you are a follower of Jesus, Jesus asked this not in such a way as it should be optional. He asked this in such a way to try to make a point. And as any good storyteller did, Jesus landed the punch. So as we look at this question, I want to encourage you, don't imagine it's coming from me. Let's just go ahead and let's give Jesus the credit for asking this question. That way you can love me after this, okay? But this is what Jesus asked. In one of his most famous sermons, he's standing on the Sermon on the Mount. He's just talked to the individuals that are standing in front of him. He's just talked to them about what it's like to be a blessing. He's just talked to people about what it's like to pray. He's just shared with them about, you've heard it said, yeah, but I'm going to tell you. He's kind of changing the rules a little bit. And then he leans in. He's got them excited. He's got them like, oh my goodness, Jesus, what's next? And he asked this question. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? To which, if you're like me, you're like, Jesus, could we talk about prayer again? Like, could I get a Sharpie and just draw through that? Like, I don't know that I really like Jesus asking this question of us. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? To which, if Jesus were asking you this today, this is probably how you would respond, right? You'd probably look at him and be like, yeah, Jesus, that is not a speck of sawdust. That can't be determined as a speck of sawdust. Can I tell you a little bit about him? He's a Republican. She's a Democrat. He watches CNN. Are you kidding me? Like, this isn't just a speck. This is something that I need to levy a war against. This isn't just a speck. They eat meat. Are you kidding me? What is wrong? They celebrate the jolly holly hole guy that comes down the chimney. How dare them lie to their kids? This isn't a speck of sawdust. Now, I know that's a little superficial, but here's the reality. Is for some of us, it's not as simple as that. It's a little more personal. For some of you, it's not a speck of sawdust, but it's your dad or your stepdad, who as a little kid, he abandoned you. He ran away and you never heard from him again. Your mom grew up raising you and your kids, and next thing you know, as a 35-year-old adult, your dad comes back into the picture saying, hey, I'm back, as if you got to accept me now. And not only that, but he's coming to you because he's hurt. He's got health issues that require you to take care of him. I don't know what it looks like, but for many of us, it's not a speck. And some of us, it's not as simple as political views. It could be as difficult as a relationship that needs to be reconciled, hurt and brokenness in the midst of a family. This is not something that is just simple and easy and just gloss over it. It'll be okay. You see, for many of us, we would look at Jesus and say, Jesus, it's not a speck of sawdust in our eye. But Jesus wasn't wanting us to focus on the speck. Jesus was wanting us to change the perspective. In fact, for many of us, we might not look at it from the speck perspective, but we might answer him and not say it's a speck, but Jesus, come on. It's not a plank in my eye. Are you kidding me? I don't have a plank in my eye. I see just fine. The world is perfectly fine. Oh, yes, I know. We talked about our vices at the beginning, but Jesus, let me just be honest with you about my vices. Let me tell you a little bit about my story. I mean, Jesus, do you know my upbringing and my environment that I was raised in? Come on, it's not a vice. It's based upon the experiences I have, the education I have, the health needs that I have, the successes, the failures. The reason I am who I am, it's not a plank. I can see good and well, but if they had the same insecurities I had, they would be dealing with the same thing too. So it's not really a plank. It's the opportunities that I've had have led me to have this. It's the IQ and the EQ. And I don't know if you know what EQ is. That might be your IQ. I don't know. But Jesus, it's not a plank. If you had the opportunity to hear my story, you would know that it's perfectly warranted. You see, for many of us, we look at the plank and we've got justifiable reasons as to why we see the way we see, why we do the way we do. We have justifiable reasons as to what is going on in our life. To which, for many of us, maybe Jesus isn't talking to us. Maybe we can just read that question and be like, he's just talking to that audience. Maybe we can read that question and be like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, okay, we'll give you the grace, right? We'll go ahead. You have justifiable reasons to have the plank in your eye, so just don't worry about it. The problem is Jesus wasn't done. He continued to ask and probe and push. In fact, he continues in this as he goes on. He says, how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, What moral authority do you have? You just told me you have a plank and it's based upon things that are justifiable. So what moral authority do you have to begin to share the good and the bad, to share the how? Why do you tell your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye? And he goes on and he says, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye. To which Jesus has got the audience. I mean, they were like, yay, yay, yay. And then all of a sudden, wait a second. This guy a little too comfortable, a little too close to home. Jesus, time out. With everybody trying to figure out, Jesus makes a two-word sentence after this. And if you're not a follower of Jesus today, this is probably a sentence that you have been tempted to make to followers of Jesus since you left the church, or maybe since you heard about Christians, as you began to read the news, as you began to look and see and experience what it's like to follow Jesus, and you begin to see people who are following Jesus, and you begin to measure the way they act outside of church, or the way they measure inside of church. Jesus said a statement that probably you've been tempted to say from time to time as you look at people who claim to be followers of Jesus. To which you probably would say, go get them, Jesus. He says this, looking at them, you hypocrite. But Jesus, it's just a plank. It's not a big plank. If you only knew, he says, you hypocrite, you sinner, you fall shorter. You did it on purpose, over and over and over. You see, Jesus looked at you knowing good and well this. And yet, he was willing to look past everything that's on your rap sheet. He looked at you and he saw all of this and he said, you know what? I realize that this is because of your upbringing. This is because of your environment, your experience. I realize that there's some struggles and hurdles, and I realize that the education you're in, I know the health struggles, I know the successes and failures, I know the insecurities you deal with, I know the opportunities you've had, I know your limitations, and knowing everything I know about you, I still offer grace anyway. Jesus looks and he knows your story. He knows your rap sheet. He knows what's good, what's bad. He knows if you've been naughty or nice. And he still is willing to grant grace. Paul, who is one of the leaders when it comes to individuals who started the church. And you've heard me say this when we reference Paul. Paul, he was a church planter who ran the Mediterranean Rim, planting churches and raising up a leader. And he'd go to the next city, plant a church, raise up a leader, go to the next city. For many non-religious sociologists, they believe that Paul might be the most instrumental individual in the spread of Christianity, even more so than Jesus. Now, we tend to believe otherwise, but that just shows the value that Paul had on the spread of Christianity. And in one of the letters, Paul's writing to the church at Rome, and he says this, and it's so fascinating when it comes to what grace looks like. He says this, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And if you really get into the technicalities of what he said, I want to imagine that Paul is sitting at a table. He's got his papyrus laid out. He's got his quill so he can write this letter to Rome. And he's documenting, he's writing it, and he gets to this point in the letter. And he pauses. And he begins to think about what Jesus had done for him. And he begins to think about it. He says, but God demonstrated his own love for me. And then it got super personal in that while I was still sinning, while I was a few hours north making a mockery of the very thing Jesus was doing, while I was a few hours north in the process of being a naughty guy, Jesus died for me. And I can only imagine Paul just stepping back and just processing what that had to look like. And I think if Paul were to rewrite it today, I think it would be a little bit more like this. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that knowing ahead of time, he knew ahead of time everything that was going to happen, knowing ahead of time the sins we would commit and confess and do again and confess again. He died for you anyway. Think about that. That is grace. And so Jesus has the audience, and he's sitting there, and he's looking at them, and they're trying to figure out, do I have a plank? I mean, that is a sawdust. It's a really big deal, but I look at the plank in my eye, and I'm trying to figure this out. And so he gives us some practical advice, some advice that when it comes to this Christmas season, some advice that could be very helpful for you as you're getting the food ready, as you're getting everything ready to celebrate this Christmas season. Jesus gives this advice to his listeners in that famous sermon. He says this, first, in other words, here's your imperative. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. You see, what Jesus is offering, what Jesus is asking for many of us, when we begin to look at the vice, the plank that's in our eye, when we begin to look at the thing that holds us back from being able to be full of grace, when we begin to look at the thing that holds us back from really, really liking that one person, and that person's probably in your mind right now, when we really begin to think about it, for me, and this is just me being personal, I tend to look at other people and I see where their shortcomings are, and I want to make sure I'm better than them. I want to make sure that my vices aren't as bad as theirs, so that God would love me more. How stupid of me. And I know for many of us, because I've talked to different people, and we begin to talk about the area we're struggling in, and it tends to come with a comparison. It tends to come with this idea, I know I shouldn't do this, but have you seen them? Like, I'm better than them, right? You see, what planks do is planks get in the way of grace. Planks get in the way of grace. Planks get in the way of us being able to really leverage grace. Planks get in the way for us being able to offer grace. Planks get in the way because all we can see is what we're doing, and we look at it through the view of what we're doing wrong and hoping that maybe we can be better than. So while Jesus landed a masterful punch, the question he asked was incredible. I've decided to shorten the question a little bit, that I think it might land a little bit easier, maybe a little more memorable. I mean, many of us were leaving here thinking, why do I look at the sawdust? What did he say? Like, I've got to go back and look at the Bible. Let's make it incredibly memorable. You ready? Got planks? You got planks? If planks get in the way of grace, my question for you is this: do you have any planks in your eyes that you're looking at and you're thinking, yeah, no? Because here's what I've found. Here's what I've seen to be true. Here's what I've experienced as I've been studying, been looking at, been engaging in the Bible and looking at the story of Jesus. As I've been looking at the accounts of Paul and the letters, when I begin to look at my life through the lens of what Jesus has for me, it changes the way I see other people. In fact, I would say this, that the more aware I am of what God has yet to do in me, the more aware I am of what God has yet to do in me, the more time I spend studying and reading, engaging with, the more time I spend looking at the life of Jesus and asking the question, what does this do to me? What does this mean to me? What did Jesus say about this? The more I lean into the writings of Paul and I see how Paul, knowing that Jesus died for him while he was being an idiot, looking at the writings of Paul and beginning to look at it and say, okay, in light of what Paul knows, how did he apply the love of Jesus? What did it look like in Paul's life? The more I get ingrained in the Word of God and ingrained in what he has for me, the easier it is for me to see what he's yet to do in me. And the less aware I am of what he has yet to do in you. You see, I become more focused on what God wants to do in my life. I get more focused on the grace that he has already bestowed upon me. And I begin to run the race in such a way that I want to make my dad proud. I begin to run the race in such a way that I want my heavenly Father to look down on me and not be like, you mean you did good, but you were a little better than him, but you got a ways to go. I want him to put his arm around me and say, look at what we can do together. You see, on Christmas, we get the chance of celebrating grace. Celebrating the idea that grace came down to earth. And he didn't come down because he wanted to make things right or make it a point. He came down because he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to offer reconciliation. He wanted to come down like a loving father and put his arm around and encourage us. He came in spite of us. You see, one of the things that fascinates me is as I look at the life of Jesus, he was more brokenhearted about the sin than he was put off about it. You think about that God was more brokenhearted about the sin that the individuals, that Jesus, when he would interact with individuals, he was more brokenhearted than he was put off. In fact, the people who were nothing like Jesus would lean in and draw them in and say, hey, come, follow me. People like you shouldn't hang out with me. It's okay. Come, follow me. You see, when you look at the life of Jesus, you find that Jesus didn't come to take sides. Jesus came to come alongside. Jesus didn't come to take sides. I mean, you have a little bit of a point if you want to look at Jesus in comparison to the religious, graceless Pharisees in that time. Like, he came to make a point and to take a side against a graceless religion that made it where not everybody can partake in, where not everybody is allowed in. He took a side when it came to that. But across the board, Jesus didn't come to take sides. He came to come alongside. And then John would come along and he would look at the life of Jesus and he would see how Jesus responded, how Jesus acted, how Jesus interacted. And John would make this statement of Jesus in one of his letters as he's describing who Jesus is. He made this statement. He said, Jesus was full of grace and truth. He was full of grace and truth. Oh, Jesus was an individual who, when he saw people who were far from him, he was brokenhearted for. He would come alongside. He'd put his arm around and say, come follow me. I mean, we talked about it in week 1 when Jesus was confronted with the woman at adultery and she's sitting at his feet and Jesus looks and there's nobody in the audience that's ready to stone her. And so he looks down at her and he says, who condemns you? And she's like, oh my goodness, nobody. To which Jesus says, neither do I. And he could have given her a big hug and said, hey, congratulations, now go on your merry way. Love, love, love. But Jesus looked at her and said, neither do I. Now go and sin no more. How awkward is that? Wait, so do you condemn me or do you not? What just happened here, Jesus? Like, there was an intrigue and excitement that Jesus was full of grace and truth, which begs the question. If we want to be more and more like Jesus, the question that I would ask you this Christmas season is, what are you full of? When you get pushed, when you get squeezed, when the sinner that's like you comes and rubs up against you and you begin to be like, oh, like, what is it that comes out of you in those moments? What is it that comes out of you whenever you are squeezed and you're like, oh my goodness, they're here. What is it that comes out? For Jesus, he was full of grace and truth. But what is it for you? And a better question I would want to ask this Christmas season is not what are you full of, but collectively. When people think about us as a church, when people think about us as individuals that collectively come together to agree on 2 things, that Jesus came on our behalf to die for our sins, and because of that grace, we should leverage it and share it with other people. My question is this, is what are we full of as a church? What are we full of? You see, because I firmly believe that the church is most appealing when grace is most apparent. The church is most appealing, that people will come and they'll begin thinking like, okay, wait a second, this is, okay, I can trust this. Don't you understand? Like, you saw my vices, you know what's going on. Like, don't you know me? Like, why would you be graceful towards me? Because that was how Jesus lived. And so he opened his arms and said, come and follow me. And as a church, we are most appealing when grace is most apparent. Now, I imagine for many of us, like, Christmas is, it's ready, right? Like, your lights are up. Your tree is up, and maybe, just maybe, your gifts are wrapped underneath the tree. And maybe, just maybe, like, you already have the menu scheduled for everything that's going to go on Christmas morning. I don't know about you, but I have a feeling that many of us, I would imagine, are ready for Christmas. But let me ask you, are you ready not for Christmas, but are you ready to celebrate this incredible experience where grace came down to earth in spite of us? Knowing good and well, are you ready to experience and to share and to be encouraged by that grace? That's the story of Christmas. And I have a feeling over the next couple of weeks, you're going to get pushed. I have a feeling over the next couple of weeks, you're going to get squeezed. I have a feeling over the next couple of weeks that you are going to get the opportunity to rub against those people that you have in mind. And you're thinking, oh, I don't want to see those people. And you're going to be challenged. Do I look at the speck of sawdust in their eye? Or do I step back and look at the plank in my eye and try to figure out, how do I get rid of this plank? You see, because for all of us, and what Jesus set forth is this idea that grace is the unsettling solution for just about everything. And Jesus was full of it. Jesus extended it to people who were far from him. He extended it to people who were nothing like him. And Jesus extended it to people who were nothing like him. And what happened was those people began to be something like him. And then they began to extend grace to other people who were nothing like him. And you saw this explosion of grace and truth in the midst of Jesus' life. So this Christmas season, let's do something unsettling. Let's do something a little bit, maybe trying, maybe a little bit against the grain of who we really are. Let's give someone what they don't expect and what they don't necessarily deserve. You see, when that becomes you, when you begin to be full of grace this Christmas season, what's going to happen is you will be amazing. And isn't that what grace really is? Amazing, amazing, amazing. God, we love you and we thank you. God, I thank you for just the fact that you would love us. God, I know that oftentimes the planks in our eyes, we have justifiable reasons why they are there. And God, if we knew each other's story, we would be able to lean in and be like, you got a point. But God, I thank you for the fact that you see the planks in our eyes, and even knowing the reason behind it, you chose to offer grace. You chose to send your Son as the greatest unsettling solution for our remarkably falling shorting lives. And so, God, I pray that this Christmas season that we would lean in and we would begin to ask the question, God, where are the planks? And God, I pray that this Christmas season would be uncharacteristically characterized by the grace that you first showed us. And may we be a conduit of that amazing grace. I love you and I thank you. And God, we confess we need you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen.